The alarm pierced through the pre-dawn darkness of Forward Operating Base Kandahar, like a blade cutting through silence. Captain Sarah Mitchell's eyes snapped open in her cramped quarters, muscle memory already pulling her upright before her. Mind had fully processed the sound. 3 short blasts, followed by 2 long ones. Incoming attack. All aircraft scramble. But as Sarah reached for her flight suit, hanging ready on the metal hook beside her narrow bunk, she knew with crushing certainty that she wouldn't be among the pilots racing toward the flight line. Not today. Not any day, according to the official policy that had followed her like a shadow through 18 months of deployment. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The year was 2003, and despite her exceptional flying record, despite graduating at the top of her class from the Air Force Academy, despite logging more flight hours than half the men in her squadron, Captain Sarah Mitchell was forbidden from flying combat missions. The reasoning was simple. According to the brass, women weren't allowed in direct combat roles. It didn't matter that she could outfly most of her male counterparts. It didn't matter that she knew the terrain around Kandahar better than anyone else in the squadron. What mattered was a policy written in Washington by people who had never felt the stick of an A-10 Thunderbolt in their hands, or seen the look in a ground soldier's eyes when close air support arrived. Just in time. Sarah had joined the Air Force with dreams that stretched as wide as the Montana sky she'd grown up under. Her father, a Vietnam veteran who'd lost his leg to a landmine outside Da Nang, had taught her that service meant putting others before yourself. Her mother, a nurse who'd worked double shifts to keep the family farm running while her husband recovered, had shown her that strength came in many forms. But nothing had prepared her for the particular frustration of being qualified for a job you weren't allowed to do. The sound of jet engines spinning up echoed across the base as Sarah sat on the edge of her bunk, still holding her flight suit. Through the thin walls of her quarters, she could hear the controlled chaos of a scramble. Pilots running, ground crews shouting coordinates, the metallic clang of weapons being loaded. Somewhere out there, American soldiers were in trouble, calling for air support that she was trained to provide, but forbidden to deliver. Her roommate, Lieutenant Jessica Chun, stirred in the bunk across the narrow room. Jessica was a transport pilot, flying C-130s, loaded with supplies and personnel between bases. Unlike Sarah, she wasn't constantly reminded of what she couldn't do. Transport missions were considered support roles, not combat, even though Jessica had been shot at more times than she could count and had landed her aircraft under fire on more than one occasion. "Another scramble?" Jessica asked, her voice thick with sleep. "Sounds like it," Sarah replied, finally hanging her flight suit back on its hook. "Probably the patrol that went out yesterday." They were heading toward the Pakistan border. Jessica sat up, suddenly more alert. "The one Lieutenant Morrison was talking about? The search and rescue?" Sarah nodded. 3 days ago, a Special Forces team had gone missing during a reconnaissance mission in the mountainous region east of Kandahar. The terrain was brutal, jagged peaks, deep valleys, and caves that could hide entire armies. It was also known Taliban territory, where American forces were about as welcome as a sandstorm in a helicopter engine. The missing team had been out of radio contact for 48 hours when the decision was made to send in a rescue operation. It was the kind of mission that required everything the military had to offer: ground troops, helicopter support, and close air support from A-10 Warthogs, the tank-killing aircraft that Sarah had been trained to fly. As the sound of departing aircraft faded into the distance, Sarah felt the familiar weight of helplessness settle over her shoulders. She was a pilot without a war to fight, a warrior benched by policy rather than ability. But she had learned during her 18 months at Kandahar that helplessness was a luxury she couldn't afford. There was always something to do, always. A way to contribute, Even if it wasn't the way she'd planned. Sarah pulled on her regular uniform and headed for the operations center. If she couldn't fly the mission, she could at least monitor it from the ground. The ops center was the nerve center of the base, where radio communications from all active missions were coordinated and tracked. It was also where she had spent countless hours over the past year and a half, learning the voices of every pilot in the squadron, memorizing the radio frequencies for every unit operating in the region, and developing an almost supernatural ability to read the stress levels. In a pilot's voice, the ops center was buzzing with activity when Sarah arrived. Banks of radios crackled with transmissions from the search and rescue operation. On the main screen, a digital map showed the approximate location of the missing Special Forces team, marked with a red X in a valley surrounded by peaks that rose like the teeth of some prehistoric beast. Major Robert Kane, the squadron's operations officer, looked up as Sarah entered. Kane was a Vietnam veteran who'd been flying military aircraft since before Sarah was born. He'd initially been skeptical of female pilots, but Sarah's competence and professionalism had won him over during their deployment. "Mitchell," he said, his voice carrying the weight of the morning's events. "Good timing. We've got 4 A-1 OS. Airborne, plus helicopter support. The ground team is about 2 hours out from the target area." Sarah took her usual position at the communications console, putting on a headset that would allow her to monitor all radio traffic from the mission. As the morning progressed, she listened to the calm professional voices of the pilots she knew so well. Captain Rodriguez, who'd grown up in East Los Angeles and still sent half his paycheck home to his mother. Lieutenant Peterson, fresh out of flight school and eager to prove himself. Captain Williams, a former enlisted man who'd worked his way up through the ranks and knew more about the A-10 than anyone else in the squadron. But as the hours passed, Sarah began to notice something in their voices that made her stomach tighten. With worry, the mission was not going according to plan. The first sign of trouble came at 0847 hours, when Captain Rodriguez's voice crackled through the radio with a tension that hadn't been there an hour earlier. "Kandahar Base, this is Hawkeye. 1. We've got eyes on the target area, but the weather is deteriorating faster than forecast. Visibility is dropping to less than a quarter mile." Sarah glanced at the meteorological report on her console. The weather briefing had called for clear skies with light winds, perfect conditions for a search and rescue operation. But the Hindu Kush Mountains were notorious for creating their own weather patterns, and what started as a clear morning could become a whiteout in minutes. "Major," Kane leaned over Sarah's shoulder to speak into the radio. "Hawkeye 1, what's your assessment? Can you maintain visual contact with the ground team?" There was a pause that seemed to stretch forever before Rodriguez responded. "Negative, Kandahar Base. We're losing the ground team in the weather. Recommend we abort and try again when conditions improve." But even as Rodriguez spoke, another voice cut through the radio chatter. It was Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, the team leader of the ground unit that had been dispatched to rescue the missing Special Forces soldiers. "Hawkeye 1, this is Rattlesnake 6. We cannot abort. Repeat, we cannot abort. We have visual contact with the missing team, and they are in immediate danger. There are approximately 30 enemy fighters moving toward their position. We need air support now." Sarah felt her heart rate spike. This was the nightmare scenario that every pilot and ground soldier feared. Friendly forces in contact with the enemy, weather closing in, and limited visibility, making it nearly impossible to distinguish between friend and foe. Major Kane's jaw tightened as he processed the information. "Rattlesnake 6, can you mark your position for the aircraft?" "Negative, Kandahar Base. Our smoke grenades won't be visible in this weather, and we don't have laser designation equipment. The enemy is less than 200 meters from the missing team and closing fast." Sarah closed her eyes, trying to visualize the terrain. She had studied every map of the region, flown training missions over similar terrain, and spent countless hours in the flight simulator practicing exactly this type of scenario. In her mind, she could see the narrow valley where the teams were trapped, the rocky outcroppings that would provide cover for attacking Taliban fighters, and the limited approach routes that would be available to the A-10s. Captain Rodriguez's voice came through the radio again, and this time Sarah could hear the frustration and concern that he was trying to keep professional. Kandahar Base, Hawkeye 1. We're circling the area, but we cannot identify targets through this weather. If we fire blind, we risk hitting friendly forces. The radio fell silent for a moment, filled only with the static of open channels and the distant sound of jet engines. Sarah knew that Rodriguez was right. Firing into a low-visibility environment without positive target identification was a recipe for a friendly fire incident. But she also knew that the ground teams were running out of time. Rattlesnake 6, this is Kandahar Base, Major Kane transmitted. Can you provide verbal direction to the aircraft? Affirmative. Kandahar Base. Enemy forces are approximately 150 meters northeast of our position, moving along a ridgeline. But the weather is getting worse, and we're going to lose radio contact soon. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning in the ops center. She had been in enough combat situations to know that when ground forces started talking about losing radio contact, it usually meant they were preparing for the worst. Lieutenant Peterson's voice joined the radio chatter. Kandahar Base, this is Hawkeye 2. I've got a possible visual on muzzle flashes, but I cannot confirm target identification. The weather is deteriorating rapidly. Sarah looked at the radar display on her console. The weather system that was causing the visibility problems was massive, stretching across hundreds of square miles of mountainous terrain. Even if the A-10s could find a clear approach route, they would be flying blind for most of their attack. It was then that Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. The radio frequency that connected the base to the airborne aircraft was starting to break up with static. The mountainous terrain, combined with the weather system, was interfering with communications. Soon, the pilots would be flying blind and deaf, unable to coordinate with the ground forces or receive updates from the base. Major Kane, Sarah said quietly, pulling off her headset. I need to speak with you privately. Kane looked at her with raised eyebrows, but followed her to a corner of the ops center, where they could speak without being overheard by the other personnel. Sir, I know that area better than anyone else in the squadron, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. I've flown training missions over that terrain dozens of times. I know the approach routes, the terrain features, and the weather patterns. Kane's expression was guarded. Mitchell, you know I can't authorize you for a combat mission. The regulations are clear. Sir, with respect, the regulations don't account for a situation like this. We have American soldiers in immediate danger, aircraft that can't see their targets, and weather conditions that are only going to get worse. I'm not asking for a combat assignment. I'm asking for permission to fly a rescue mission. Kane was quiet for a long moment, weighing the options. Sarah could see the internal struggle in his eyes, the conflict between following regulations and doing whatever was necessary to save American lives. Even if I wanted to authorize it, Kane said finally, I don't have the authority to override Department of Defense policy. That decision would have to come from much higher up the chain of command. Sarah felt her heart sink, but she pressed on. Sir, what if we don't call it a combat mission? What if we call it a search and rescue operation? Technically, my primary mission would be to locate and extract the missing Special Forces team, not to engage enemy forces. Kane looked at her with something that might have been admiration, or might have been concern for her career. Mitchell, you're talking about flying into a combat zone with enemy forces actively engaged. There's no way to spin that as anything other than a combat mission. But even as Kane spoke, Sarah could see the wheels turning in his mind. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and conventional solutions weren't working. Sometimes in the military, you had to choose between following the rules and accomplishing the mission. "Sir," Sarah said, "there's something else. The radio communications are starting to break up. Soon, the pilots won't be able to coordinate with the ground forces at all. But I know that terrain well enough to navigate it, even in low visibility conditions. I've studied every mountain, every valley, every possible approach route." Kane looked back at the radio console, where the voices of the pilots were becoming increasingly strained. The weather was continuing to deteriorate, and the ground forces were still under threat from approaching enemy fighters. "Mitchell, what you're suggesting could end both our careers," Kane said quietly. "Sir, if we don't do something, it's going to end a lot more than our careers," Sarah replied. Kane was quiet for another long moment, and Sarah could see him weighing the consequences. Finally, he spoke. "There's a spare A-10 on the flight line. Maintenance finished the inspection an hour ago, and it's fueled and ready. Hypothetically, if someone were to take that aircraft for a training flight, and if during that training flight they happen to encounter American forces in distress, military protocol would require them to render assistance." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "Sir, are you saying—" "I'm saying that I'm going to be in the bathroom for the next 10 minutes, Kane interrupted. "And when I come back, I expect to find all personnel accounted for and all aircraft properly secured." Sarah understood. Kane was giving her plausible deniability, a way to take action without officially authorizing her to violate regulations. It was a career-ending risk for both of them, but it was also the only way to save the lives of American soldiers. "Sir, I understand," Sarah said. "I'll be sure to properly secure all aircraft while you're away." Kane nodded and walked toward the exit. As he reached the door, he paused and looked back at Sarah. "Mitchell, if you do decide to take that hypothetical training flight, remember that the rules of engagement still apply. You cannot engage enemy forces unless American lives are in immediate danger." "Understood, sir." Kane left the ops center, and Sarah was alone with the radio chatter from the deteriorating mission. She had perhaps 10 minutes before Kane returned. And in that time, she would have to make a decision that would change her life forever. Sarah's hands moved with practiced efficiency as she gathered the materials she would need. Flight helmet, survival radio, emergency beacon, and the detailed terrain maps she had studied obsessively during her months at Kandahar. Each item had its place in the ritual of preparing for flight, but this time felt different. This time, she was preparing for the mission she had been trained for but never allowed to fly. The walk to the flight line took 3 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. Sarah's mind raced through the technical challenges she would face: flying in low visibility conditions, navigating mountainous terrain without GPS guidance, and potentially engaging enemy forces while minimizing the risk to friendly troops. It was the kind of mission that pilots train for in simulation, but hoped they would never have to fly in real life. The A-10 Thunderbolt II sat on the tarmac like a predator at rest, its distinctive twin engines mounted high on the fuselage, its massive 30mm cannon protruding from the nose, and its straight wings designed for low-altitude flight made it look more like a flying tank than a traditional aircraft. Sarah had always loved the A-10, not for its beauty, which was purely functional, but for its purpose. It was an aircraft designed to save lives, to provide close air support to ground forces when they needed it most. Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, the crew chief responsible for the aircraft, looked up in surprise as Sarah approached. Rodriguez was a 20-year veteran who had worked on A-10s longer than Sarah had been flying them. He knew every bolt, every wire, every system on the aircraft. "Captain Mitchell, I wasn't expecting anyone to take this bird up today. All the combat sorties are already airborne." Sarah took a breath. knowing that her next words would make Rodriguez a co-conspirator in whatever was about to happen. "Sergeant, I need to take this aircraft for a training flight. Emergency authorization. From Major Kane." Rodriguez looked at her with eyes that had seen enough military operations to recognize when something unusual was happening. "Ma'am, with respect, this doesn't feel like a training flight." I can hear the radio chatter from the rescue operation. Sarah met his gaze directly. "Sergeant, American soldiers are in trouble. That's all you need to know." Rodriguez was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Aircraft is fueled and ready. Weapons systems are loaded with standard mixed ordnance high explosive and armor-piercing rounds. All systems checked and operational." "Thank you, Sergeant. I'll bring her back in one piece." "You'd better, ma'am. I've got too much work invested in this bird to lose her now." Sarah climbed into the cockpit with movements that were automatic after thousands of hours of flight time. The A-10's cockpit was designed for function rather than comfort, with switches and displays arranged for maximum efficiency during combat operations. But to Sarah, it felt like home. She ran through the pre-flight checklist with mechanical precision, even as her mind focused on the mission ahead. Engine start, system checks, weapons verification, radio equipment test. Each step brought her closer to the moment when she would taxi to the runway and commit herself to a course of action that would either save lives or end her career. The tower controller's voice crackled through her headset as she prepared to taxi. "Kandahar Tower, this is Hawkeye 6 requesting taxi clearance for local training flight." There was a pause, and Sarah wondered if the controller had been briefed on the situation. Finally, the response came. "Hawkeye 6, cleared to taxi runway 09. Winds are light and variable. Visibility 3 miles and decreasing." Sarah pushed the throttles forward, and the A-10 began its slow taxi toward the runway. As she moved, she switched her radio to the frequency being used by the rescue operation. The voices of the pilots already in the area filled her headset, and she could hear the growing desperation in their transmissions. "Kandahar Base, this is Hawkeye 1. We are bingo fuel in 15 minutes. We need immediate relief on station, or we're going to have to return to base." "Hawkeye 1, this is Rattlesnake 6. Enemy forces are within 100 meters of the missing team. We need air support now." Sarah's jaw tightened. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and the pilots already on station were running out of fuel. Even if they could locate targets through the weather, they would soon be forced to return to base, leaving the ground forces without air support. She reached the end of the runway and performed her final checks. Engine temperatures normal, fuel quantity sufficient, weapon systems armed and ready. In the distance, she could see the mountains where American soldiers were fighting for their lives, shrouded in the weather system that was making the rescue operation so difficult. "Kandahar Tower, Hawkeye 6 ready for departure. Hawkeye 6, cleared for takeoff runway 09. Contact departure control on frequency 134.5. Sarah pushed the throttles to full power, and the A-10 began its takeoff. Roll. The aircraft accelerated slowly but steadily, its powerful engines pushing it down the runway until it finally lifted off into the gray morning sky. As she climbed toward the mountains, Sarah switched her radio back to the rescue frequency and transmitted the words that would change everything. "Kandahar Base. This is Hawkeye 6. I am airborne and proceeding to the target area. Request immediate tactical update." There was a moment of silence, and Sarah wondered if Major Kane had returned to the ops center. Finally, his voice came through the radio. "Carefully neutral. Hawkeye 6, be advised you are entering a combat zone with friendly forces in contact. Weather conditions are deteriorating, and visibility is less than 1/4 mile. Enemy forces are approximately 100 meters from friendly positions." Sarah could hear the unspoken message in Kane's transmission. He was giving her official approval for the mission, couched in language that would protect them both if questions were asked later. She was no longer a pilot on an authorized training flight. She was a military aviator responding to a tactical emergency. Kandahar Base. Hawkeye, 6 copies. I am proceeding to provide close air support to friendly forces. As Sarah flew toward the mountains, she thought about the path that had brought her to this moment. The years of training, the frustration of being denied combat assignments, the countless hours spent studying terrain and tactics while her male colleagues flew the missions she had been trained for. All of it had led to this moment, when her knowledge and skills would finally be put to the test in the most challenging circumstances possible. The weather ahead looked ominous, with low clouds and reduced visibility that would make navigation treacherous. But Sarah had studied this terrain until she knew it better than the streets of her hometown. She could fly these mountains in her sleep, and today, she might have to do exactly that. As she approached the target area, Sarah began to understand why the other pilots had been unable to locate the enemy forces. The combination of mountainous terrain, low clouds, and reduced visibility created a maze of shadows and false targets. Finding enemy fighters in these conditions would require more than just good eyesight. It would require intimate knowledge of the terrain and the ability to read the subtle signs that indicated human presence. Rattlesnake 6, this is Hawkeye 6. I am approaching your position from the south. Can you provide a situation update? Staff Sergeant Torres's voice came through the radio with barely controlled urgency. Hawkeye 6, we have visual contact with the missing team. They are approximately 200 meters northeast of our position, trapped in a small valley. Enemy forces are approaching from multiple directions, and we estimate 30 to 40 fighters. Sarah banked her aircraft to the left, following the terrain features she had memorized from countless hours of map study. Even through the reduced visibility, she could make out the distinctive rock formations that marked the valley where the teams were trapped. Rattlesnake 6, I have visual contact with your approximate position. I am going to make a low pass to identify targets. Be prepared to mark your position with whatever means available. Sarah pushed the nose of the A-10 down, descending into the valley at an altitude that would have been considered dangerous in good weather and was potentially suicidal in current conditions. But she needed to get low enough to see through the haze and identify the positions of both friendly and enemy forces. As she descended, Sarah began to see the chess game that was playing out below her. The missing Special Forces team was trapped in a narrow valley, with enemy forces approaching from 2 directions. The rescue team was positioned on a ridge overlooking the valley, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Without air support, both teams would be overrun within minutes. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah pulled up from her low pass and began to plan her attack. The enemy forces were spread out along multiple ridgelines, making it difficult to engage them without risking friendly fire. She would have to make precise surgical strikes that would eliminate the threat while ensuring the safety of the American soldiers below. Rattlesnake 6, this is Hawkeye 6. I have identified enemy positions on ridgelines to the north and east of your position. I am going to engage targets on the eastern ridge first, then move to the northern positions. Keep your heads down. Sarah banked the A-10 into a steep diving turn, lining up on the eastern ridgeline where she had spotted muzzle flashes and movement. The 30mm cannon beneath her aircraft was loaded with armor-piercing rounds designed to destroy tanks, but it would be equally effective against enemy fighters positioned in rocky terrain. As she dove toward the target, Sarah felt the familiar calm that came with combat flying. All of her training, all of her preparation, all of her frustration with being denied combat assignments faded away. There was only the aircraft, the target, and the mission. The A-10's cannon roared to life, sending a stream of 30mm rounds into the rocky positions where enemy fighters had been preparing to assault the trapped American soldiers. Sarah could see the impact of her rounds, sending rock and debris flying as the high-explosive shells found their targets. She pulled up from her attack, run, and immediately began setting up for a second pass. The northern ridgeline still held enemy forces, and she could see muzzle flashes as they returned fire toward her aircraft. Small arms fire was largely ineffective against the A-10's armored cockpit, but Sarah knew that the enemy might have rocket-propelled grenades or other weapons that could pose a threat. Hawkeye 6, this is Rattlesnake 6. Outstanding work. You've eliminated approximately half the enemy force on the eastern ridge. Enemy forces on the northern ridge are still active and pose a threat to the missing team. Sarah smiled grimly as she set up for her second attack. This was what she had been trained for, what she had dreamed of doing since she first put on a uniform. She was finally doing the job she had been born to do. The second attack run was more challenging, as the enemy forces had now identified her as a threat and were actively trying to shoot her down. Sarah could see tracers arcing up toward her aircraft as she dove toward the northern ridgeline. But the A-10 was designed to take punishment, and she pressed her attack despite the incoming fire. Her cannon found its mark again, silencing the enemy positions on the northern ridge. As she pulled up from her attack, Sarah could see the immediate effect of her intervention. The enemy forces that had been closing in on the trapped American soldiers were either dead or fleeing toward the Pakistani border. Rattlesnake 6, this is Hawkeye 6. I show no further enemy activity in your immediate area. You are cleared to proceed with the rescue operation. Hawkeye 6, this is Rattlesnake 6. Mission accomplished. The missing team is secure, and we are beginning extraction procedures. Outstanding work, pilot. You saved American lives today. As Sarah climbed away from the valley, she felt a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. She had finally flown the mission she had been trained for, and she had proven that her gender was irrelevant when it came to saving lives. But she also knew that the real challenge was just beginning. She would have to return to base and face the consequences of her decision to disobey regulations and fly a combat mission. The flight back to Kandahar gave Sarah time to think about what had just happened. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and there was no way to predict what the consequences would be. But as she looked back at the valley where American soldiers were now safe because of her actions, she knew that she had made the right choice. The tower controller's voice crackled through her headset as she approached the base. Hawkeye 6, Kandahar Tower, you are cleared for landing. Runway 09. Wind is calm, visibility improving. Sarah smiled at the comment about improving visibility. The weather was clearing, but the storm surrounding her career was just beginning. The landing at Kandahar was one of the smoothest Sarah had ever executed, but her hands were shaking as she taxied the A-10 back to its parking spot. The adrenaline that had carried her through the combat mission was beginning to fade, replaced by the sobering reality of what she had just done. She had violated direct orders, ignored military policy, and flown an unauthorized combat mission. In the military justice system, those actions could result in anything from a reprimand to a court-martial. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was waiting for her as she shut down the engines, his weathered face showing a mixture of concern and professional curiosity. As the crew chief, he would be responsible for inspecting the aircraft and documenting any damage from the mission. More importantly, he would be one of the first people to officially confirm that Captain Mitchell had returned from what was supposed to be a training flight with expended ammunition. How did she handle, Captain? Rodriguez asked as Sarah climbed down from the cockpit, his voice carefully neutral. Like a dream, Sergeant. She brought me home safe. Sarah handed him her flight helmet, noting the way his eyes immediately went to the empty ammunition counter display. You'll want to do a full inspection. I encountered some unexpected training scenarios. Rodriguez nodded slowly. I'll make sure she's properly documented, ma'am. All systems performed within normal parameters? Affirmative. No malfunctions, no system failures. She performed exactly as designed. As Sarah walked away from the aircraft, she could see Rodriguez beginning his post-flight inspection with particular attention to the gun bay. Within an hour, there would be an official record that the A-10 had expended its ammunition during what was logged as a training flight. That record would trigger questions that would eventually reach the highest levels of the Air Force command structure. The operations center was buzzing with activity when Sarah returned. The successful rescue operation had energized the entire base, and she could see the relief on the faces of the personnel who had been monitoring the mission. But she also noticed that Major Kane was nowhere to be seen, and several of the senior officers were speaking in hushed tones near the command console. Lieutenant Jessica Chun approached Sarah with an expression of amazement and concern. "Sarah, what the hell did you just do? The entire base is talking about some mystery pilot who showed up and saved the rescue operation." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. "I took an aircraft for a training flight and encountered American forces in distress. Military protocol required me to render assistance." Jessica stared at her for a long moment. "Sarah, you flew a combat mission. You engaged enemy forces. You saved American lives. But you're not authorized for combat operations." "I'm aware of the regulations, Jess. I'm also aware that American soldiers were about to die." Before Jessica could respond, the operations center door opened and Colonel James Harrison entered with two other officers Sarah didn't recognize. Harrison was the base commander, a career military officer who had been flying combat missions since the Gulf War. His face was expressionless as he scanned the room, but Sarah could see the tension in his posture. "Captain Mitchell," Harrison sighed, his voice carrying the authority of command. "I need to speak with you privately, now." Sarah followed Harrison to his office, her mind racing through the possible consequences of her actions. Court-martial proceedings, discharge from the military, criminal charges for disobeying orders. She had known the risks when she made the decision to fly the mission, but facing those consequences was different from contemplating them. Harrison's office was spartanly decorated, with only a few personal photos and his various military awards on the walls. He gestured for Sarah to sit in the chair across from his desk, then closed the door and activated a small device that Sarah recognized as the electronic countermeasures unit designed to prevent electronic surveillance. "Captain Mitchell," Harrison began, his tone carefully measured, "I've just received a very interesting report from the rescue operation. According to the ground team leader, an unidentified A-10 pilot appeared during the mission and provided close air support that saved the lives of 7 American soldiers." Sarah sat perfectly still, knowing that her response would determine how the rest of this conversation proceeded. "Sir, I filed a flight plan for a training mission. During that flight, I encountered American forces in distress and rendered assistance, as required by military protocol." Harrison leaned back in his chair, studying Sarah with eyes that had seen enough military operations to recognize when someone was walking a very thin line. "Captain, the aircraft you flew expended its entire ammunition load during this training flight. The ground team reported precision strikes that eliminated enemy forces without causing any friendly casualties. That level of performance suggests a pilot with extensive combat experience." Sarah met his gaze directly. "Sir, I followed all applicable rules of engagement and took every precaution to ensure the safety of friendly forces." "Captain, you are not authorized for combat operations. You violated direct orders and military policy by flying that mission." Harrison's voice was stern, but Sarah detected something else in his tone, something that might have been admiration. "Sir, I understand the regulations. I also understand that my primary duty as a military officer is to protect American lives." Harrison was quiet for a long moment, then opened a file folder on his desk. Captain, I've reviewed your service record. You graduated second in your class from the Air Force Academy. You have more flight hours than any other pilot in your squadron. Your instructors consistently rated you as one of the most skilled pilots they had ever trained. But you've been denied combat assignments for your entire career because of a policy that says women cannot serve in direct combat roles. Sarah felt a flicker of hope. Sir, I've always believed that my gender should not determine my ability to serve. Captain, what you did today was either the most heroic act I've seen in 25 years of military service, or it was the most flagrant violation of military discipline I've ever encountered. Possibly both. Harrison stood and walked to the window that looked out over the airfield. I have a choice to make, Captain. I can follow regulations and initiate court-martial proceedings against you for disobeying orders and violating military policy. Or I can find a way to frame your actions as a legitimate military response to an emergency situation. Sarah's heart was pounding, but she kept her voice steady. Sir, I understand that my actions have put you in a difficult position. I take full responsibility for my decisions. Harrison turned back to face her. Captain, the problem is that your actions were not only justified, they were necessary. 7 American soldiers are alive today because you had the courage to do what needed to be done. But the military is not always good at recognizing when courage conflicts with regulations. Sir, what are you saying? Harrison returned to his desk and pulled out a different file. Captain, I'm saying that there are some people in Washington who are very interested in what happened here today. The rescue operation has been classified at the highest levels, and there are questions being asked about how an unidentified pilot was able to perform so effectively in such challenging conditions. Sarah felt a chill of apprehension. Sir, are you saying that people know what I did? Captain, I'm saying that people know what somebody did. And they're asking questions about whether current military policy makes sense in light of what happened today. Harrison leaned forward, his expression becoming more serious. Captain, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I need you to give me an honest answer. Are you prepared to face the consequences of your actions, whatever they might be? Sarah thought about the faces of the soldiers she had saved, about the years of frustration and denied opportunities, about the oath she had taken to defend her country. Sir, I knew the risks when I made the decision to fly that mission. I'm prepared to accept whatever consequences result from my actions. Good, because you're about to find out what those consequences are. The summons came 3 days later, delivered by a military courier who arrived at Sarah's quarters at 0600 hours with orders that would change her life forever. The envelope bore the seal of the Pentagon and was marked with classifications that Sarah had never seen before. Inside was a single sheet of paper directing her to report to Washington, D.C. within 48 hours for a classified briefing with officials from the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Sarah read the orders twice, trying to understand what they meant. She had expected court-martial proceedings, administrative hearings, or disciplinary action. She had not expected to be summoned to the Pentagon by officials she had never heard of for purposes that were not explained. Major Kane found her in the mess hall an hour later, sitting alone with a cup of coffee and the classified orders spread out on the table in front of her. His expression was carefully neutral, but Sarah could see the concern in his eyes. Mitchell, I heard about your new travel arrangements, he said, sitting down across from her. Any idea what this is about? Sarah shook her head. Sir, I've been trying to figure that out for the past hour. The orders don't specify the nature of the briefing, and I don't recognize any of the officials I'm supposed to meet with. Kane glanced around the mess hall to make sure they weren't being overheard. Mitchell, there are rumors flying around the base about what happened during the rescue operation. Some people are saying that the pilot who saved those soldiers was someone who wasn't supposed to be flying combat missions. Sarah felt her chest tighten. Sir, what kind of rumors? The kind that suggests someone might have violated military policy to save American lives. The kind that make people ask questions about whether that policy makes sense. Kane leaned forward, lowering his voice. Mitchell, I need you to understand something. What you did out there was extraordinary. You saved 7 lives under conditions that would have challenged the most experienced combat pilot. But you also opened a door that some people in Washington have been trying to keep closed. Sir, I don't understand. Mitchell, there are people in the Pentagon who have been arguing for years that women should be allowed to serve in combat roles. There are other people who believe that current policy is necessary to maintain military effectiveness. Your actions have provided ammunition for both sides of that debate. Sarah felt a sudden understanding of why she was being summoned to Washington. Sir, are you saying that I'm being called to testify about women in combat? I'm saying that you've become the poster child for a debate that has been going on for decades. And depending on how that debate resolves, you're either going to be celebrated as a hero or prosecuted as a criminal. Kane stood to leave, then paused. Mitchell, when you get to Washington, remember that you're not just representing yourself. You're representing every woman who has ever wanted to serve her country in combat. Don't let them make you apologize for saving American lives. The flight to Washington was the longest of Sarah's life. She sat in the military transport aircraft, surrounded by other personnel traveling on various assignments, trying to prepare for a meeting that could determine the future of her career and potentially the future of women in the military. Sarah thought about the path that had brought her to this moment. Growing up on a farm in Montana, she had dreamed of flying since she was old enough to look up at the sky. Her parents had supported her ambitions, even when those ambitions led her into traditionally male-dominated fields. They had taught her that courage meant doing what was right, even when it was difficult. The Pentagon was even more imposing than Sarah had imagined. The massive 5-sided building housed the nerve center of American military power, and walking through its corridors felt like entering the heart of the machine that protected the country. Sarah had been in military facilities her entire adult life, but the Pentagon felt different, more serious, more consequential. She was met at the security checkpoint by a Navy lieutenant who introduced himself as her escort. He led her through a maze of corridors and security checkpoints to a conference room deep within the building. The room was windowless and spartanly furnished, with a long table surrounded by chairs and a projection screen at one end. Captain Mitchell, the lieutenant said, please wait here. The briefing will begin shortly. Sarah sat alone in the conference room for 20 minutes, trying to calm her nerves and prepare for whatever was about to happen. She had faced enemy fire, flown in dangerous conditions, and made split-second decisions that determined whether people lived or died. But sitting in that conference room, waiting to meet with Pentagon officials about her unauthorized combat mission, was more nerve-wracking than any combat situation she had ever faced. The door opened and 5 people entered the room. Sarah recognized none of them, but their bearing and the way they carried themselves suggested that they held significant positions within the military hierarchy. The woman who appeared to be leading the group was wearing the uniform of an Air Force colonel, with ribbons and decorations that indicated extensive combat experience. Captain Mitchell, the colonel said, I'm Colonel Patricia Reeves, Deputy Director of Personnel Policy for the Air Force. Thank you for coming. Sarah stood at attention. Ma'am, it's an honor to meet you. Please, sit down. We have a lot to discuss. Colonel Reeves took the seat across from Sarah, while the other officials arranged themselves around the table. Captain, I'm going to be direct with you. We know what you did in Afghanistan. We know that you flew an unauthorized combat mission that saved the lives of 7 American soldiers. And we know that your actions have raised questions about current military policy regarding women in combat. Sarah felt her heart rate increase. Ma'am, I followed all applicable rules of engagement and took every precaution to ensure the safety of friendly forces. Captain, you also violated direct orders and military policy by flying that mission. Under normal circumstances, those actions would result in court-martial proceedings and possible discharge from the military. Sarah swallowed hard. Ma'am, I understand the consequences of my actions. Colonel Reeves leaned forward. Captain, these are not normal circumstances. Your actions have attracted attention at the highest levels of government. The Secretary of Defense has personally reviewed your case, and there are members of Congress who are asking questions about why one of our most skilled pilots has been denied the opportunity to serve in combat. Sarah felt a flicker of hope, but she kept her expression neutral. Ma'am, I've always believed that my gender should not determine my ability to serve. Captain, the question we're facing is not whether you're capable of serving in combat. Your actions in Afghanistan prove that beyond any doubt. The question is whether we're going to continue to maintain policies that prevent capable soldiers from doing their jobs. One of the other officials, a man wearing the uniform of an Army general, spoke for the first time. Captain Mitchell, your case has become a catalyst for a broader discussion about military policy. There are people who want to use your actions to argue for changing the regulations that prevent women from serving in combat roles. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. Sir, I never intended to become a symbol for anything. I just wanted to save American lives. Captain, Colonel Reeves said, sometimes history chooses us rather than the other way around. The question is whether you're prepared to help us change military policy for the better. Sarah thought about all the women who had served with distinction in non-combat roles, all the pilots who had been denied the opportunity to fly the missions they had trained for, all the soldiers who had been told that their gender disqualified them from serving their country to the fullest extent of their abilities. Ma'am, what exactly are you asking me to do? Colonel Reeves smiled for the first time since entering the room. Captain, we're asking you to help us make sure that what happened to you never happens to another qualified soldier. We're asking you to help us change the policy that prevented you from doing your job. The briefing room fell silent as Sarah processed what Colonel Reeves had just said. She had expected to face consequences for her actions, not to be asked to help change military policy. The weight of the moment settled on her shoulders like a heavy blanket. Ma'am, Sarah said carefully, I need to understand exactly what you're proposing. Are you asking me to testify before Congress? To speak publicly about what happened? Colonel Reeves exchanged glances with the other officials before responding. Captain, we're asking you to participate in a comprehensive review of military policy regarding women in combat. This review will involve testimony before congressional committees, briefings with senior military officials, and potentially public appearances to explain why current policy needs to change. The Army general leaned forward. Captain Mitchell, your case has already attracted significant attention from Congress. There are senators and representatives who believe that your actions demonstrate the absurdity of preventing qualified women from serving in combat roles. They want to hear from you directly. Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Sir, I'm honored to be asked to participate in this process. But I need to understand what this means for my career and my future in the military. Captain, Colonel Reeves said, that's exactly what we need to discuss. Your participation in this policy review will effectively end your current assignment and likely change the trajectory of your military career permanently. You would be assigned to a special Pentagon unit focused on policy development and implementation. Sarah's mind raced through the implications. Ma'am, are you saying that I would no longer be a pilot? Captain, you would still be a pilot, but your primary duty would be helping to develop and implement new policies that would allow other women to serve in combat roles. You would be pioneering a path that other female soldiers could follow. The weight of the decision pressed down on Sarah. She had joined the military to fly combat missions, not to become a policy advocate. But she also understood that her actions had created an opportunity to change the system for future generations of female soldiers. "Ma'am, what happens if I decline to participate in this review?" Colonel Reeves' expression became more serious. "Captain, that's certainly your right. But I need to be honest with you about the alternatives. If you decline to participate in the policy review, you would return to your unit and face the consequences of your unauthorized combat mission. Those consequences would likely include court-martial proceedings, possible discharge from the military, and the end of your flying career." Sarah felt the walls closing in around her. "So my choices are to become a policy advocate or face court-martial." "Captain, your choices are to help us change a system that prevented you from doing your job, or to accept punishment for doing that job anyway. Neither option is ideal, but one of them creates the possibility of positive change." The room fell silent again as Sarah considered her options. She thought about the 7 soldiers whose lives she had saved, about the years of frustration she had experienced being denied combat assignments, about the other women who might face the same limitations if policy didn't change. "Ma'am, if I agree to participate in this review, what guarantees do I have that meaningful change will actually occur?" Colonel Reeves looked at the other officials before responding. "Captain, I can't guarantee that Congress will change the law or that the Secretary of Defense will change policy. But I can guarantee that your voice will be heard at the highest levels of government. Your actions have already started a conversation that couldn't be started before." The Army general added, "Captain, change in the military happens slowly, but it does happen. Racial integration, the acceptance of women in non-combatant roles, the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, all of these changes required individuals who were willing to stand up and speak out. You have the opportunity to be that person for this issue." Sarah thought about her parents, who had taught her that courage meant doing what was right, even when it was difficult. She thought about her oath as a military officer to defend the Constitution and protect American lives. She thought about the future female soldiers, who might be prevented from serving their country to the fullest extent of their abilities if current policy remained unchanged. "Ma'am, I have one more question. If I participate in this review and policies do change, what happens to my flying career? Will I ever get to fly combat missions again?" Colonel Reeves smiled. "Captain, if policies change the way we hope they will, you'll be among the first women officially authorized to fly combat missions. You'll help train the next generation of female combat pilots. You'll be part of making sure that no qualified soldier is ever again prevented from serving because of their gender." Sarah felt a surge of emotion as she considered the possibility. For years, she had dreamed of flying combat missions as part of her regular duties, not as a violation of regulations. The opportunity to help create that reality for herself and other women was more appealing than any individual assignment. "Ma'am, I need to understand the timeline. How long would this policy review process take?" "Captain, we estimate that the review process will take approximately 18 months. During that time, you would be assigned to Washington, working with policy experts, military lawyers, and congressional staff to develop recommendations for changing current regulations." Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would determine the direction of her life for years to come. "Ma'am, I accept the assignment. I'm ready to help change military policy to ensure that gender is not a barrier to serving our country." The relief in Colonel Reeves' expression was immediate and obvious. "Captain, I'm glad to hear that. Your decision takes courage, and I believe it will make a significant difference in the lives of future soldiers." The meeting continued for another hour with detailed discussions about the process Sarah would be entering, the challenges she would face, and the support she would receive. As the officials filed out of the room, Colonel Reeves remained behind to speak with Sarah privately. "Captain," she said, "I want you to know that what you're about to do will not be easy. There will be people who question your motives, who challenge your qualifications, and who argue that your actions were inappropriate. You'll need to be prepared for intense scrutiny and criticism. Sarah nodded. Ma'am, I understand that this won't be easy. But I also understand that it's necessary. Captain, there's something else I need to tell you. Your actions in Afghanistan didn't just save 7 lives. They proved that American women can perform at the highest levels of combat operations. That proof is what's going to make this policy change possible. As Sarah left the Pentagon that evening, she felt a mixture of apprehension and excitement about the path ahead. She had entered the building as a pilot facing potential court-martial for violating regulations. She was leaving as a policy advocate with the opportunity to change those regulations for future generations. The flight back to Kandahar gave Sarah time to process what had happened and prepare for the challenges ahead. She would be leaving her unit, her friends, and the combat zone where she had finally proven herself as a pilot. But she would be entering a new phase of her career, where she could help ensure that other women wouldn't face the same barriers she had encountered. Doubt as the transport aircraft descended toward Kandahar, Sarah looked out at the mountains where she had flown her unauthorized combat mission. In a few weeks, she would be leaving this place behind to begin a new mission in Washington. But she would always remember the moment when she had finally been allowed to do the job she had trained for, even if it meant breaking the rules to do it. The story of Captain Sarah Mitchell was just beginning. The flight that had saved 7 lives was about to become the catalyst for changing American military policy forever. And the pilot who had been denied combat flight status was about to become the woman who ensured that no qualified soldier would ever be denied that opportunity again. 6 months into her assignment at the Pentagon, Sarah found herself sitting in a congressional hearing room that felt more like a gladiatorial arena than a place of government deliberation. The House Armed Services Committee was conducting hearings on military personnel policy, and Sarah was scheduled to testify about her experiences as a female pilot in a combat zone. The room was packed with reporters, military officials, advocates on both sides of the women in combat debate, and members of Congress who would ultimately decide whether decades of military policy would change. Sarah had spent weeks preparing for this moment, working with military lawyers and policy experts to craft testimony that would be both compelling and legally sound. But no amount of preparation could fully ready her for the intensity of the scrutiny she was about to face. She was no longer just Captain Sarah Mitchell, pilot. She had become a symbol, a test case, and a lightning rod for one of the most contentious debates in modern military policy. Congressman Robert Hayes, the committee chairman, called the hearing to order with a gravity that reflected the significance of the testimony about to be heard. Hayes was a former Marine who had served in Vietnam, and his weathered face showed the kind of experience that commanded respect from both sides of the political aisle. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hayes began, "we are here today to examine current military policy regarding women in combat roles, and specifically to hear testimony from Captain Sarah Mitchell regarding her experiences serving in Afghanistan. Captain Mitchell's case has raised important questions about whether our current policies serve the best interests of military effectiveness and national security." Sarah felt her heart rate increase as Hayes introduced her to the committee. She had faced enemy fire and flown in dangerous conditions, but sitting at the witness table in front of cameras and microphones felt more daunting than any combat mission. "Captain Mitchell," Hayes continued, "you are here today because your actions in Afghanistan have sparked a national conversation about women in combat. Before we discuss those actions, please tell the committee about your background and qualifications as a military pilot." Sarah leaned forward to the microphone, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I graduated from the Air Force Academy in 2001, ranking 2nd in my class. I completed pilot training at the top of my class and was certified to fly the A-10 Thunderbolt II. an aircraft designed specifically for close air support missions. I have logged over 2,000 flight hours, including 800 hours in the A-10, and I have completed advanced training in combat tactics, weapon systems, and emergency procedures. Congressman Hayes nodded. Captain, those are impressive qualifications. Now please tell the committee about the incident in Afghanistan that brought you to our attention. Sarah had rehearsed this part of her testimony dozens of times, but the words still felt heavy as she spoke them. Mr. Chairman, on the morning in question, American forces were conducting a search and rescue operation for missing Special Forces personnel. Weather conditions had deteriorated beyond forecast, and the pilots providing air support were unable to identify targets or coordinate effectively with ground forces. American soldiers were in immediate danger from enemy forces and the aircraft. On station, we're running low on fuel. Captain, interrupted Congresswoman Lisa Martinez, a Democrat from California who had been a vocal advocate for expanding women's roles in the military. You were not authorized to fly combat missions at that time, correct? That is correct, ma'am. Military policy at the time prohibited women from serving in direct combat roles, which included flying close air support missions. So when you decided to fly that mission, you were knowingly violating military policy? Sarah felt the weight of the question. Her answer would determine how the rest of her testimony was received. Ma'am, I was faced with a situation where American lives were in immediate danger, and I had the training and knowledge necessary to help save those lives. I made the decision that my duty to protect American soldiers superseded the policy that prevented me from doing so. The hearing room erupted in murmurs from the gallery, and Congressman Hayes gavelled for order. Sarah could see the division in the room, some people nodding in approval, others shaking their heads in disapproval. Congressman William Turner, a Republican from Texas who had been a vocal opponent of expanding women's combat roles, leaned forward with a stern expression. Captain Mitchell, you took it upon yourself to decide which military policies you would follow and which you would ignore. How do we maintain military discipline if individual soldiers can simply choose which orders to obey? Sarah had expected this line of questioning, but the hostility in Turner's voice was more intense than she had anticipated. Sir, military discipline is essential to effective operations. But military officers also have a duty to protect American lives, and when those two obligations conflict, the preservation of life must take precedence. Captain, you violated a direct order. In any other context, that would result in court-martial proceedings. Are you suggesting that female soldiers should be exempt from military discipline? Sarah felt a flash of anger but kept her voice level. Sir, I am suggesting that military policy should be based on capability and qualifications, not on gender. If I had been a male pilot with identical qualifications, I would have been authorized to fly that mission from the beginning. Congressman. Turner's expression hardened. Captain, military policy exists for reasons that go beyond individual qualifications. The integration of women into combat roles raises questions about unit cohesion, physical capabilities, and the unique challenges of combat environments. Sir, with respect, my actions in Afghanistan demonstrated that those concerns are not supported by evidence. I successfully completed a challenging combat mission under difficult conditions, working effectively with ground forces and achieving the objective without friendly casualties. Congresswoman Martinez jumped back into the questioning. Captain Mitchell, can you describe the specific actions you took during the mission? Sarah took a breath, knowing that her description of the combat action would be scrutinized by military experts and potentially used by both sides of the debate. Ma'am, I flew into a combat zone with reduced visibility and identified enemy forces that were threatening trapped American soldiers. I conducted precision strikes that eliminated the threat while ensuring the safety of friendly forces. The mission resulted in the successful rescue of 7 American soldiers with no friendly casualties. Captain, in your assessment, could any other pilot in your squadron have accomplished the same mission under those conditions? Sarah considered the question carefully. Ma'am, the mission required intimate knowledge of the terrain, the ability to operate in low visibility conditions, and the skill to make precision strikes in close proximity to friendly forces. While other pilots in my squadron are highly qualified, I had spent more time studying that specific terrain and had more experience with the particular challenges of that operational environment. Congressman Hayes intervened before Turner could continue his hostile questioning. Captain Mitchell, what do you believe this experience teaches us about military policy regarding women in combat? Sarah felt the weight of the moment. Her answer would be quoted in newspapers, analyzed by policy experts, and potentially influence the decisions of lawmakers for years to come. Mr. Chairman, I believe this experience demonstrates that military effectiveness should be the primary consideration in personnel policy. Gender should not be a disqualifying factor for any military role if an individual meets the necessary qualifications and standards. American soldiers deserve to have the best qualified personnel supporting them, regardless of whether those personnel are male or female. The hearing continued for another 2 hours, with Sarah facing questions that ranged from supportive to openly hostile. She was asked about everything from her physical fitness scores to her personal relationships, from her childhood motivations for joining the military to her views on feminist ideology. Through it all, she maintained her focus on the central argument that military policy should be based on capability rather than gender. As the hearing concluded, Sarah felt emotionally drained, but also oddly hopeful. She had presented her case to the American people through their elected representatives, and while not everyone had been convinced, she had made her argument clearly and professionally. Outside the hearing room, Sarah was approached by a young woman in military uniform who introduced herself as Lieutenant Amanda Rogers, a helicopter pilot who had been following Sarah's case closely. Captain Mitchell, Rogers said, I just wanted to thank you for what you're doing. I've been flying helicopters for 3 years, and I've always wondered what it would be like to fly combat missions. Your testimony today gives me hope that maybe someday I'll have that opportunity. Sarah felt a surge of emotion as she realized that her actions were creating possibilities for other women that hadn't existed before. Lieutenant, keep training, keep pushing yourself, and keep believing that you belong in whatever role you're qualified for. Change is coming, and pilots like you are going to be ready for it. As Sarah walked through the halls of Congress that evening, she reflected on how much her life had changed since that morning in Afghanistan when she had made the split-second decision to fly an unauthorized combat mission. She had gone from being a frustrated pilot to being the face of a movement that could reshape American military policy. The real work was just beginning. The aftermath of Sarah's congressional testimony created a media firestorm that neither she nor the Pentagon had fully anticipated. Within hours of the hearing's conclusion, video clips of her exchange with Congressman Turner were circulating on news networks and social media platforms. Opinion polls showed a sharp divide along both political and generational lines, with younger Americans overwhelmingly supporting the expansion of women's combat roles while older demographics remained more skeptical. Sarah found herself at the center of a national conversation that extended far beyond military policy. Talk show hosts, newspaper columnists, and academic experts all weighed in on what her case meant for gender equality, military effectiveness, and American values. She received hundreds of letters from military families, veteran organizations, and women's rights groups, expressing everything from enthusiastic support to angry condemnation. The Pentagon assigned Sarah, a media relations specialist, Major Jennifer Walsh, to help her navigate the intense public attention. Walsh was a career public affairs officer who had managed controversial cases before, but even she seemed surprised by the volume of interview requests and speaking invitations that poured in after the hearing. "Captain," Walsh said during one of their daily briefings, "we've received requests from 63 different media outlets in the past week alone. CNN, Fox News, 60 Minutes, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, everyone wants to interview you. We need to be strategic about which opportunities you accept." Sarah rubbed her temples, feeling overwhelmed by the attention. "Major, I never wanted to become a celebrity. I just wanted to fly combat missions. How do we handle this without compromising the policy review process?" "Captain, the reality is that you've become the public face of this issue whether you wanted to or not. The question is whether we use that platform to advance the cause of policy change, or whether we let others define the narrative for us." Sarah understood the logic, but the constant scrutiny was taking a toll. She had joined the military to serve her country, not to be a political symbol. But she also recognized that her visibility was creating opportunities for change that hadn't existed before. The decision was made to accept a limited number of high-profile interviews, focusing on outlets that would allow Sarah to present her case thoughtfully rather than being reduced to sound bites. The first major interview was scheduled with 60 Minutes, the long-running news program known for its in-depth reporting on important national issues. The 60 Minutes crew arrived at the Pentagon on a crisp October morning, equipped with cameras and lighting equipment that transformed a standard conference room into a television studio. The correspondent, Patricia Roberts, was a veteran journalist who had covered military affairs for over 20 years. Her reputation for tough but fair questioning had made her interview requests highly sought after by newsmakers who wanted to be taken seriously. "Captain Mitchell," Roberts began after the cameras started rolling, "6 months ago, you were an unknown Air Force pilot stationed in Afghanistan. Today, you're at the center of a national debate about women in combat. How has that transformation affected you personally?" Sarah had practiced her answer to this question, but sitting under the bright lights with cameras recording her every word made it feel more significant. "Patricia, the attention has been overwhelming, but I try to remember that this isn't really about me. It's about whether we're going to have military policies that make sense in the 21st century. It's about ensuring that every qualified American has the opportunity to serve their country to the fullest extent of their abilities. Captain, critics say that you violated military discipline by flying that unauthorized mission. How do you respond to the argument that individual soldiers cannot simply choose which orders to follow?" "Patricia, military discipline is absolutely essential to effective operations. But military officers also swear an oath to protect American lives, and when those two obligations conflict, the preservation of life must take precedence. In the situation I faced, following policy would have meant allowing American soldiers to die when I had the capability to save them." Roberts leaned forward, her expression serious. "Captain, some people argue that your case is being used to push a political agenda that goes beyond military policy. How do you respond to that criticism?" Sarah felt a flash of frustration but kept her voice level. "Patricia, this isn't about politics or ideology. It's about military effectiveness. The question is simple. Should the most qualified person be allowed to do the job, regardless of their gender? I believe the answer is yes, and I think most Americans agree with that principle." The interview continued for over an hour, covering everything from Sarah's childhood motivations for joining the military to the specific details of her combat mission in Afghanistan. Roberts was thorough but fair, allowing Sarah to present her case while also challenging her on the difficult questions that critics had raised. When the interview aired 2 weeks later, it drew the largest audience that 60 Minutes had seen in over a year. The program's website crashed within hours due to traffic from viewers wanting to watch additional footage and read background materials about women in combat policy. The public response was immediate and intense. Sarah's Pentagon email account was flooded with messages from military personnel, veterans, and civilians expressing their views on her case. The vast majority were supportive, but the critical messages were often harsh and personal in ways that surprised Sarah with their intensity. One message that particularly affected Sarah came from Master Sergeant Linda Thompson, a veteran who had served 3 deployments in Iraq as a military police officer. Thompson's message was brief but powerful. Captain Mitchell, I spent 3 years in Iraq doing convoy security, getting shot at, returning fire, and protecting my fellow soldiers. But because my job was classified as support rather than combat, I was never officially recognized as having served in a combat role. Your courage in speaking out gives me hope that future generations of military women won't face the same bureaucratic nonsense that we've had to deal with. Thank you for taking the heat so that others won't have to. Messages like Thompson's reminded Sarah why her advocacy was important, even when the personal cost was high. She was fighting not just for her own right to fly combat missions, but for the principle that capability should determine opportunity in the American military. The policy review process was also advancing, though more slowly than Sarah had hoped. Teams of military lawyers, personnel experts, and operational commanders were examining every aspect of current policy, from physical fitness standards to unit housing arrangements. The complexity of the issues involved meant that change would be incremental rather than revolutionary. But Sarah could see progress being made. Colonel Reeves provided regular updates on the review process during weekly meetings in her Pentagon office. Captain, she said during one particularly encouraging briefing, we're seeing movement on multiple fronts. The Army is developing new standards for combat positions that focus on job-specific requirements rather than gender-based exclusions. The Navy is examining policies that prevent women from serving on submarines and in certain special operations roles. Your case has created momentum for change across all branches of the military. Sarah felt a sense of satisfaction at the progress, but she also understood that policy changes were just the beginning. Ma'am, what about implementation? How do we ensure that policy changes actually translate into opportunities for women in the field? Captain, that's the next phase of this process. Once new policies are approved, we'll need to develop training programs, update recruitment materials, and change the culture in units that haven't previously included women in combat roles. That's where your experience and credibility will be particularly valuable. As winter approached, Sarah reflected on the unexpected path her life had taken. A year earlier, she had been a frustrated pilot denied the opportunity to do the job she had trained for. Now she was at the forefront of a policy change process that could reshape the American military for generations. The personal cost had been high, the constant scrutiny, the criticism, the loss of the simple identity she had enjoyed as just another pilot. But the potential impact made those sacrifices worthwhile. The real test would come when new policies were implemented and women were actually assigned to combat positions. Sarah knew that every female soldier who followed in her footsteps would face scrutiny and pressure to prove that the policy change had been justified. Success would require not just changing regulations, but changing minds and cultures that had been shaped by decades of different practices. But for the first time since arriving in Washington, Sarah felt genuinely optimistic about the future. Change was happening, slowly but surely, and she was playing a role in ensuring that future generations of military women would have opportunities that she had been denied. The phone call came at 0530 hours on a cold December morning, waking Sarah from the deepest sleep she had experienced in months. The voice on the other end belonged to Colonel Reeves, and the urgency in her tone immediately told Sarah that something significant had happened. Captain Mitchell, I need you to get to the Pentagon immediately. The Secretary of Defense is announcing major policy changes this morning, and you need to be briefed before the press conference. Sarah was fully awake now, her heart racing with anticipation and anxiety. Ma'am, what kind of policy changes? Captain, I can't discuss details over the phone. Just get here as quickly as possible. This is what we've been working toward for the past year. The drive to the Pentagon took Sarah through the pre-dawn darkness of Washington, D.C., past monuments and government buildings that had become familiar during her assignment there. But this morning felt different, charged with the electricity of impending change. After 18 months of hearings, reviews, interviews, and advocacy, the moment of truth had finally arrived. The Pentagon was bustling with unusual activity for such an early hour. Military officials, policy experts, and public affairs personnel moved through the corridors with the purposeful energy that preceded major announcements. Sarah was escorted directly to Colonel Reeves' office, where she found not just Reeves, but also the Secretary of Defense himself, Robert Gates, along with several other senior officials she recognized from previous meetings. Captain Mitchell, Secretary Gates said, rising from his chair to shake her hand, thank you for everything you've done to help us reach this point. Your courage and professionalism have been essential to this process. Sarah felt honored and intimidated to be in the same room with the Secretary of Defense. Sir, it's been an honor to serve and to contribute to this review. Secretary Gates gestured for Sarah to sit down. Captain, in approximately 3 hours, I will be announcing the most significant changes to military personnel policy in over 20 years. The review process that you helped initiate has resulted in new policies that will open virtually all combat positions to qualified women. Sarah felt her breath catch. After months of incremental progress and bureaucratic obstacles, the announcement she had hoped for was finally happening. Sir, does this mean that all combat positions will be open to women? Captain, the new policy removes gender-based exclusions from all military occupational specialties. Women will be eligible for any position for which they meet the physical and professional qualifications. This includes infantry, armor, special operations, and yes, combat pilot positions. Colonel Reeves leaned forward. Captain, this means that qualified women will no longer be prevented from flying combat missions because of their gender. The barriers that you faced will not exist for future generations of female pilots. Sarah felt a surge of emotion as the implications sank in. The policy that had prevented her from flying combat missions for years, that had forced her to violate regulations to save American lives, would no longer exist. Future women would be able to serve in any role for which they were qualified, without the arbitrary barriers that had shaped her own career. Sir, Sarah said, what about implementation? How will these changes be put into practice? Secretary Gates opened a briefing folder. Captain, implementation will be phased over the next 2 years. Each service will develop gender-neutral standards for all positions, focusing on the specific physical and mental requirements needed for success. Women who meet these standards will be eligible for assignment to any unit or position. Captain, Colonel Reeves added, you'll be playing a key role in this implementation. You'll be assigned to lead a team that develops training programs for female combat pilots and helps establish the cultural changes needed to integrate women into previously all-male units. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders once again. Ma'am, I'm honored to be asked to take on that role. But I have to ask, will I finally be able to fly combat missions myself? Secretary Gates smiled. Captain, under the new policy, your qualifications and experience make you immediately eligible for combat flying assignments. If you choose to return to operational flying, you'll be among the first women officially authorized to fly combat missions in American military history. The briefing continued for another hour, covering the details of the policy changes, the timeline for implementation, and the public rollout strategy. Sarah learned that her case had been the catalyst for a comprehensive review that examined not just women in combat, but broader questions about how the military identified and utilized talent regardless of gender. As the meeting concluded, Secretary Gates asked to speak with Sarah privately. After the other officials left the room, he sat down across from her with an expression that was both serious and paternal. "Captain Mitchell," he said, "I want you to understand the significance of what you've accomplished. Your actions in Afghanistan didn't just save 7 lives. They started a conversation that has resulted in fundamental changes to American military policy. You should be proud of what you've achieved." Sarah felt humbled by the praise from such a senior official. "Sir, I never intended to become an advocate for policy change. I just wanted to serve my country and protect American lives. Captain, sometimes the most important changes come from people who aren't trying to change the world. They're just trying to do their jobs. Your commitment to excellence and your courage in speaking out have made a difference that will affect generations of military women." Secretary Gates stood to leave, then paused at the door. "Captain, I have one more thing to tell you. The President has been following your case closely, and he specifically asked me to convey his gratitude for your service and your contribution to this policy change. He wanted you to know that your actions reflect the best values of American military service." As Sarah left the Pentagon that morning, she felt a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. The policy fight that had consumed the past year of her life was essentially over, won in a way that exceeded her most optimistic expectations. But she also understood that the real work was just beginning. Changing policy was one thing. Changing culture and proving that the policy change was justified would be quite another. The press conference announcing the policy changes drew massive media attention. Sarah watched from the Pentagon briefing room as Secretary Gates announced that all combat positions would be open to qualified women, effective immediately for some positions and phased in over 2 years for others. The questions from reporters were intense and sometimes skeptical, but Gates handled them with the authority and confidence that had made him one of the most respected defense secretaries in recent memory. After the press conference, Sarah was approached by Lieutenant Amanda Rogers, the helicopter pilot who had thanked her after the congressional hearing months earlier. Rogers was now wearing the insignia of a captain, having been promoted during the time Sarah had been in Washington. "Captain Mitchell," Rogers said, "I wanted to thank you again and to let you know that I've applied for transition training to become a combat pilot. Because of what you've done, I'll actually have that opportunity." Sarah felt a deep sense of satisfaction as she realized that the changes she had helped bring about were already creating new possibilities for other women. "Captain Rogers, congratulations on your promotion and on taking advantage of these new opportunities. Just remember that you'll be representing all of us. No pressure." Rogers laughed. "No pressure at all. But seriously, thank you for taking the hit so that we don't have to. You've made it possible for women like me to pursue our dreams without having to break regulations to do it." As Sarah walked through the Pentagon that evening, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. 1.5 years earlier, she had been a frustrated pilot, denied the opportunity to do the job she had trained for because of policies that seemed increasingly outdated. Now she was about to begin a new phase of her career, helping to implement changes that would affect the entire American military. The unauthorized combat mission that had started this entire process seemed like a lifetime ago. But Sarah knew that everything that had happened since the congressional testimony, the media attention, the policy review, and now the policy changes had been worth the personal cost she had paid. Tomorrow, she would begin the work of turning policy changes into reality. But tonight, for the first time in months, she allowed herself to simply feel proud of what she had accomplished. 2 years after the policy changes were announced, Sarah found herself back in the cockpit of an A-10 Thunderbolt II, but this time everything was different. She was flying as part of a training exercise designed to integrate female pilots into combat squadrons, and her wingman was Captain Amanda Rogers, the helicopter pilot who had thanked her after the congressional hearing and had since completed Transition training to become a combat pilot. The exercise was taking place over the same training range in Nevada where Sarah had first learned to fly the A-10 years earlier. But now, instead of being the only woman in a squadron of male pilots, she was leading a flight that included 3 female pilots and 2 male pilots, a ratio that would have been unimaginable just a few years earlier. Hawkeye lead, this is Hawkeye 2, Roger's voice crackled through the radio. I have visual contact with the target area. Ready to commence attack run on your command. Sarah smiled inside her helmet. Rogers had proven to be a natural combat pilot, adapting quickly to the different demands of fixed-wing attack aircraft after years of flying helicopters. Her success, along with that of dozens of other women who had entered combat roles since the policy changes, was providing concrete evidence that the new policies were working. Hawkeye 2, cleared to commence attack run. Remember to stay above the minimum altitude until target acquisition. Sarah watched as Roger's aircraft dove toward the target range, executing a textbook attack run that would have impressed any instructor pilot. The precision and professionalism she displayed was exactly what Sarah had hoped to see when she had first advocated for opening combat positions to women. The training exercise continued for another hour, with the mixed-gender flight practicing the kind of close air support missions that Sarah had been denied the opportunity to fly officially for so many years. Each pilot performed with the skill and dedication that had made American military aviation the most effective in the world, regardless of their gender. After landing, Sarah gathered her flight in the debriefing room for the post-mission analysis. That was standard after every training exercise. The pilots sat around a table, reviewing video footage of their attack runs and discussing lessons learned from the exercise. Overall assessment, Sarah began. This was an excellent training mission. All pilots demonstrated proficiency in target identification, weapons delivery, and communication procedures. Captain Rogers, your transition from rotary wing to fixed-wing aviation continues to be impressive. Rogers beamed with pride. Thank you, ma'am. I have to say, this is exactly the kind of flying I dreamed about when I first joined the Air Force. I'm grateful for the opportunity to do this mission. Lieutenant Jennifer Hayes, the youngest pilot in the flight, raised her hand. Ma'am, can I ask you a question about the policy changes? I've read about what you went through to help make this possible, but I'm curious about what it was like to be the only woman in combat aviation for so long. Sarah considered the question carefully. Hayes had entered the Air Force after the policy changes were implemented, and she had never experienced the barriers that had defined Sarah's early career. Her question was a reminder of how much had changed in just a few short years. Lieutenant, Sarah said, the frustration of being denied opportunities because of your gender rather than your qualifications is difficult to describe. Imagine being told that you're not allowed to do the job you've trained for, not because you lack the skills or knowledge, but because of an arbitrary characteristic you have no control over. The policy changes mean that women like you will never have to experience that frustration. Captain Mike Peterson, one of the male pilots in the flight, spoke up. Ma'am, I have to admit that I was skeptical when the policy changes were first announced. I worried about unit cohesion and whether integrating women into combat roles would create problems. But flying with Captain Rogers and the other women in our squadron has shown me that my concerns were unfounded. Sarah appreciated Peterson's honesty. She knew that changing policies was only the first step in a process that also required changing attitudes and cultures that had developed over decades. The fact that male pilots like Peterson were openly acknowledging the success of integration was evidence that the cultural changes were happening alongside the policy changes. Captain Peterson, Sarah said, your willingness to adapt and judge pilots based on their performance rather than their gender is exactly what makes these policy changes successful. Integration works when people focus on capability rather than preconceptions. The debriefing concluded with Sarah assigning study materials for the next day's training mission, which would focus on night operations and challenging weather conditions. As the pilots filed out of the room, Rogers remained behind to speak with Sarah privately. "Ma'am," Rogers said, "I wanted to ask you about something personal. I've been selected for a deployment to Afghanistan next month, and I'll be flying combat missions in the same area where you flew your unauthorized mission years ago. Do you have any advice for someone who's about to experience combat for the first time?" Sarah felt a surge of emotion as she realized that Rogers would be flying officially authorized combat missions in the same skies where Sarah had once been forced to break regulations to save lives. "Captain, the most important thing to remember is that your mission is to protect American lives. Focus on your training, trust your equipment, and never forget that the soldiers on the ground are counting on you to be at your best when they need you most. Ma'am, I also wanted to thank you again for everything you did to make this possible. I know that the personal cost was high, and I want you to know that women like me will never forget what you sacrificed to open these doors." Sarah was touched by Rogers' gratitude, but she also wanted to ensure that the younger pilot understood her own role in the ongoing success of the integration process. "Captain, the most important thing you can do to honor what we've achieved is to excel in your mission. Every woman who flies combat missions now is proving that the policy changes were justified. Your success is the ultimate validation of everything we've worked for." After Rogers left, Sarah remained alone in the debriefing room, reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The unauthorized combat mission in Afghanistan that had started this entire process seemed like it had happened in a different lifetime. The frustrated pilot who had been denied opportunities because of her gender had evolved into a leader who was helping to shape the future of American military aviation. The policy changes that had seemed impossible just a few years earlier were now routine reality. Women were serving in infantry units, special operations teams, submarine crews, and combat flying squadrons. The integration process had not been without challenges, but the overall success had exceeded even the most optimistic predictions. Sarah's own career had taken unexpected turns since returning to operational flying. She had been promoted to major and was now serving as the operations officer for a composite squadron that included both male and female pilots. Her experience in policy development had made her a valuable resource for other units that were implementing integration programs. But perhaps most importantly, Sarah was finally doing the job she had always wanted to do. She was flying combat missions, leading other pilots, and serving her country without the artificial barriers that had once defined her career. The sense of fulfillment she felt was deeper than anything she had experienced during her years. The sense of fulfillment she felt was deeper than anything she had experienced during her years. A policy advocate. As Sarah prepared to leave the base that evening, she received a phone call from Colonel Reeves, who was now serving as the Director of Personnel Policy for the entire Air Force. Reeves was calling with news that would shape the next phase of Sarah's career. "Major Mitchell," Reeves said, "I have an opportunity that I think will interest you. We're establishing a new program to train female pilots from allied nations in combat operations. The program would be based at Nellis Air Force Base, and we want you to lead it. You would be responsible for developing training curricula, managing international relationships, and proving that the integration model we've developed in the United States can work for other militaries as well." Sarah felt excited by the opportunity. Leading an international program would allow her to expand the impact of the changes she had helped bring about beyond the American military. "Ma'am, that sounds like exactly the kind of assignment I'd be interested in. When would the program begin?" "Major, we're looking at a start date 6 months from now. This would be a significant career opportunity for you. and it would allow you to continue advancing the cause of women in combat on an international scale. As Sarah hung up the phone, she thought about how much her life had changed since that morning in Afghanistan when she had made the split-second decision to fly an unauthorized combat mission. That decision had not only saved 7 lives, it had started a chain of events that had transformed American military policy and created opportunities for thousands of women who would serve in future generations. The young pilot who had been denied combat flight status was now a leader who was helping to shape the future of military aviation around the world. The mission that had almost ended her career had instead become the foundation for a legacy that would outlast her own service. Sarah walked out of the debriefing facility into the Nevada sunset, already planning the curriculum for training programs that would prepare the next generation of female combat pilots. The work was far from over, but the foundation had been built. The barriers that had once seemed insurmountable had been overcome, and the future was full of possibilities that had once seemed impossible. The unauthorized mission was now ancient history. What mattered now was ensuring that the opportunities created by that moment of courage would continue to expand and evolve for generations to come. 5 years after the policy changes were implemented, Major Sarah Mitchell stood before an audience of 200 female military officers from 12 different countries at the International Women in Combat Leadership Conference in Brussels, Belgium. As the keynote speaker, she was about to address an audience that represented the global expansion of opportunities for women in military service, opportunities that had seemed impossible just a few years earlier. The conference had been organized by NATO to share best practices for integrating women into combat roles, and Sarah's story had become a case study that was being examined by military leaders around the world. Countries that had previously excluded women from combat positions were now looking to the American experience as a model for their own policy changes. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah began, her voice carrying the confidence that came from years of speaking to audiences both large and small. 7 years ago, I was a frustrated pilot who was denied the opportunity to do the job I had trained for because of policies that seemed increasingly out of touch with reality. Today, I stand before you as someone who has had the privilege of helping to change those policies and create opportunities that didn't exist before. The audience included pilots, infantry officers, special operations personnel, and senior military leaders from countries ranging from traditional allies like Canada and the United Kingdom to nations like Jordan and Israel that were pioneering new approaches to women in combat. Sarah could see in their faces the same determination and frustration that she had once felt. "The question we faced," Sarah continued, "was not whether women could perform in combat roles. Women had been performing in combat situations for decades, even when their roles were officially classified as support rather than combat. The question was whether our policies would catch up with the reality of modern warfare." Sarah clicked to the first slide of her presentation, which showed a photograph of her standing next to an A-10 Thunderbolt II in full combat configuration. The image had been taken during her first official combat deployment after the policy changes, and it had become iconic in discussions about women in military aviation. "The mission I flew in Afghanistan that started this entire process was not exceptional because I was a woman," Sarah said. "It was exceptional because it demonstrated that in modern warfare, the distinction between combat and support roles has become largely meaningless. When American soldiers are in danger, the most qualified person available should be allowed to help them, regardless of their gender." Colonel Elena Vasquez, a fighter pilot from the Spanish Air Force, raised her hand during the question period that followed Sarah's presentation. "Major Mitchell, Spain is currently considering opening fighter pilot positions to women for the first time. What advice would you give us about managing the cultural challenges that come with this kind of policy change?" Sarah had faced this question many times over the past few years as more countries grappled with similar decisions. Colonel Vasquez, the most important factor in successful integration is ensuring that standards remain high while becoming gender neutral. Focus on the specific requirements needed for success in each role, rather than assumptions about what men or women can or cannot do. Major Mitchell asked Captain Lisa Chun from the Australian Defence Force, "How do you respond to critics who argue that integrating women into combat units creates risks to unit cohesion and operational effectiveness?" Sarah smiled, remembering when she had faced similar skepticism during her own congressional testimony years earlier. Captain Chun, the evidence speaks for itself. In the 5 years since the United States opened all combat positions to women, we have seen no decrease in operational effectiveness and significant improvements in recruitment and retention. The key is focusing on individual qualifications rather than group stereotypes. The conference continued for 3 days with panels, workshops, and networking sessions that brought together military women from around the world. Sarah was struck by the diversity of experiences represented from countries where women had been serving in combat roles for decades to nations where female military service was still controversial. On the final evening of the conference, Sarah was approached by Lieutenant Colonel Fatima Al-Rashid from the United Arab Emirates Air Force. Al-Rashid was one of the first female fighter pilots in her country's history, and her presence at the conference represented a significant step forward for women's rights in the Middle East. Major Mitchell, Al-Rashid said, "I wanted to thank you for your keynote address and for the example you have set. In my country, there are still many people who believe that women cannot serve effectively in combat roles. Your story gives me ammunition to argue against those prejudices." Sarah was moved by Al-Rashid's comments, particularly because she understood the additional cultural challenges that women in some countries faced when pursuing military careers. Colonel Al-Rashid, "Your courage in breaking barriers in your own country is just as important as anything I've done. Every woman who succeeds in a combat role makes it easier for the next woman to follow." "Major, I wanted to ask you about something specific. I've been selected to lead a combat mission next month, our first with a female pilot in command. The mission will be closely watched by senior leadership and the media. Do you have any advice for handling that kind of pressure?" Sarah thought back to her own experiences with high-profile missions and media attention. "Colonel, the most important thing to remember is that you're not just representing yourself. You're representing all the women who will come after you. But don't let that pressure change how you approach the mission. Focus on your training. Trust your team and execute the mission to the best of your ability. Success is the best response to skepticism." As the conference concluded, Sarah reflected on how much the international landscape had changed since her unauthorized mission in Afghanistan. Countries that had once excluded women from combat roles were now actively recruiting female pilots, infantry officers, and special operations personnel. The ripple effects of policy changes in the United States had spread around the world, creating opportunities for women that hadn't existed before. The flight back to the United States gave Sarah time to think about the next phase of her career and the ongoing challenges facing women in combat roles. While significant progress had been made, she knew that the work was far from over. Each generation of female military personnel would face new challenges and would need to prove themselves in ways that their male counterparts often took for granted. Sarah's own career had continued to evolve since returning to operational flying. She had completed multiple combat deployments, served in leadership positions at various levels, and was now being considered for promotion to lieutenant colonel. Her experience in policy development had made her a valuable resource for senior military leaders who were grappling with ongoing questions about recruitment, retention, and operational effectiveness. But perhaps most importantly, Sarah had been able to mentor dozens of young women who were following in her footsteps. The international training program she had developed at Nellis Air Force Base had graduated over 100 female combat pilots from allied nations, many of whom were now serving in leadership positions in their home countries. As her aircraft descended toward Washington, D.C., Sarah thought about the young women who were currently in flight school, infantry training, or special operations programs around the world. They would face challenges and opportunities that she could barely imagine, but they would do so with the knowledge that barriers that had once seemed insurmountable could be overcome through courage, competence, and persistence. The unauthorized combat mission that had started this journey was now just one chapter in a much larger story about changing military policy and expanding opportunities for qualified personnel. But Sarah knew that the principles that had guided her decision to fly that mission, the obligation to protect American lives, and the belief that capability should determine opportunity, would continue to guide the next generation of military leaders. The work of building a more inclusive and effective military was ongoing, and Sarah was proud to be part of that effort. 10 years after her unauthorized combat mission in Afghanistan, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell found herself in a situation she could never have imagined during those early days of policy advocacy and media attention. She was standing in the Oval Office of the White House, about to receive the Distinguished Flying Cross from the President of the United States, not for her policy work or her advocacy, but for her performance during a recent combat mission that had saved the lives of 37 American soldiers. The mission had taken place 6 months earlier during a deployment to Syria, where Sarah was serving as the operations officer for a joint task force conducting counter-terrorism operations. When a special forces team had been surrounded by enemy fighters during a reconnaissance mission, Sarah had led a 4-aircraft flight that provided close air support for over 2 hours, enabling the ground team to fight their way to safety. What made the mission particularly significant was not just its tactical success, but the composition of the flight that Sarah had led. 2 of the 4 pilots under her command had been women: Captain Amanda Rogers, who had become one of the most experienced female combat pilots in the Air Force, and First Lieutenant Maria Santos, a young pilot who had grown up reading about Sarah's story and had joined the military specifically to become a combat pilot. President David Martinez, the first Hispanic American president, had specifically requested that Sarah's award ceremony be held in the Oval Office rather than in a larger venue, saying that he wanted to personally thank her for her service and her role in advancing military policy. As Sarah stood at attention in her dress uniform, she reflected on the unlikely journey that had brought her to this moment. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell, President Martinez began, reading from the citation, for extraordinary achievement while participating in aerial flight as flight leader of a close air support mission on the 15th of March 2013. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell's exceptional airmanship and tactical expertise were instrumental in the successful extraction of a surrounded Special Forces team. Her leadership under fire and precise weapons delivery in challenging conditions prevented significant friendly casualties and contributed directly to mission success. As the President pinned the Distinguished Flying Cross to Sarah's uniform, she felt a profound sense of completion. The medal represented official recognition not just for a single mission, but for a career that had overcome barriers and created opportunities for others. It was validation that her decision to fly that unauthorized mission years earlier had been not just morally justified, but had led to a path of continued service and achievement. Lieutenant Colonel, President Martinez said after the formal ceremony concluded, "I want you to know that your story has been personally meaningful to me. As someone who has faced barriers because of my background, I understand the courage it takes to challenge systems that seem unfair or outdated." Sarah was honored to hear such personal comments from the President. "Sir, I've been privileged to serve during a time when the military has become more inclusive and more effective because of that inclusiveness. The real credit belongs to all the women who have proven that these policy changes were justified." Lieutenant Colonel, I'm curious about your perspective on the current state of women in combat. What challenges remain, and what opportunities do you see for continued progress? Sarah had given considerable thought to this question over the years, particularly as she had taken on more senior leadership roles. Sir, the most significant challenges now are cultural rather than policy-related. We've changed the regulations, but changing attitudes and assumptions takes longer. Every woman in a combat role still faces pressure to prove that she belongs there in ways that men often don't experience. President Martinez nodded thoughtfully. What do you think needs to happen to address those cultural challenges? Sir, I think the solution is continued excellence and visibility. Every woman who succeeds in a combat role makes it easier for the next woman to be accepted. Over time, having women in these positions will become normal rather than exceptional. The President smiled. Lieutenant Colonel, speaking of continued service, I understand that you're being considered for command of a combat wing. How do you feel about that possibility? Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Command of a combat wing would make her one of the most senior female officers in the Air Force and would position her to influence military policy and culture at the highest levels. Sir, if I'm selected for that position, I would be honored to serve. I believe that having women in senior leadership positions is essential to ensuring that the military continues to attract and retain the best talent regardless of gender. After the ceremony concluded, Sarah was approached by General Patricia Thompson, who had recently been promoted to serve as the first female Chief of Staff of the Air Force. Thompson had been following Sarah's career closely and had been instrumental in nominating her for the Distinguished Flying Cross. Sarah, General Thompson said, using Sarah's first name in recognition of their long professional relationship, I wanted to talk to you about your future career path. Your performance over the past decade has been exceptional, and you're being considered for positions that would make you one of the most influential officers in the Air Force. Sarah was intrigued by the General's comments. Ma'am, I'm grateful for any opportunities to continue serving and to help shape the future of the Air Force. Sarah, I'm going to be direct with you. We're looking at you for command of the 355th Wing at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base. It's one of our primary A-10 wings, and it would make you the first woman to command a combat wing in Air Force history. Are you interested? Sarah felt a surge of excitement mixed with the weight of responsibility. Command of a combat wing would represent the pinnacle of her operational career and would provide a platform to influence the next generation of pilots and leaders. Ma'am, I would be honored to be considered for that position. Sarah, I need you to understand what you would be taking on. As the first woman to command a combat wing, you would face intense scrutiny from both supporters and critics of women in combat. Your performance would be seen as a test case for whether women can successfully lead at the highest levels of military operations. Sarah thought about the pressure she had faced throughout her career, from the congressional testimony to the media attention to the constant awareness that her actions reflected on all women in the military. Ma'am, I've been dealing with that kind of pressure for most of my career. I understand the responsibility, and I'm prepared to meet it. General Thompson smiled. I thought you'd say that. The formal announcement will be made next month, but I wanted to give you time to prepare for what's coming. Command of the 355th Wing will be challenging in ways that go beyond normal military leadership. You'll be writing the playbook for future female commanders. As Sarah left the White House that evening, she thought about the journey that had brought her from a frustrated pilot-denied combat assignments to a senior officer being considered for historic command positions. The unauthorized mission, Afghanistan, had been just the beginning of a career that had consistently pushed boundaries and created new precedents. The medal on her uniform represented not just personal achievement, but the success of a broader effort to create a military that utilized talent based on capability rather than gender. Every mission she had flown, Every leadership position she had held, and every barrier she had overcome had contributed to a legacy that would benefit future generations of military women. But Sarah also understood that her story was just one part of a much larger transformation in American military culture. Across all branches of the military, women were serving with distinction in roles that had been closed to them just a few years earlier. The integration process that had seemed so controversial and uncertain when it began had become a routine. Part of military operations. As she drove through the streets of Washington that evening, Sarah reflected on the young women who were currently in military academies, flight school, and combat training programs around the country. They would inherit opportunities that previous generations could only dream of, but they would also face new challenges and responsibilities that came with being pioneers in their own right, the work of building a more inclusive and effective military was ongoing, and Sarah was grateful to continue playing a role in that effort. The unauthorized mission that had started it all was now ancient history, but the principles that had guided that decision, courage, competence, and commitment to protecting American lives, remained as relevant as ever. 15 years after the unauthorized mission that changed her life and American military policy, Colonel Sarah Mitchell stood on the tarmac at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, watching as the last A-10 Thunderbolt II of her final combat deployment taxied to its parking spot. At 52 years old, after 30 years of military service, Sarah was preparing for retirement from the Air Force, but her legacy would continue through the hundreds of pilots she had trained, the policies she had helped shape, and the barriers she had broken throughout her career. As the commander of the 355th Wing for the past 5 years, Sarah had overseen the most successful integration of women into combat aviation in military history. Under her leadership, the wing had achieved the highest mission success rates in the Air Force while becoming a model for diversity and inclusion that was studied by military organizations around the world. The retirement ceremony was held in the same hangar where Sarah had first addressed her wing upon taking command. The audience included current and former members of her wing, senior military officials, members of Congress, and representatives from women's organizations who had followed her career closely. But for Sarah, the most meaningful attendees were the female pilots who had served under her command and who would carry forward the work she had begun. General Patricia Thompson, now the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the highest ranking woman in American military history, served as the ceremony's keynote speaker. "Colonel Mitchell," she began, "your career has been defined not just by personal achievement, but by your commitment to opening doors for others. When you flew that unauthorized mission in Afghanistan 15 years ago, you could not have imagined that it would lead to the transformation of American military policy." Sarah sat in the front row, wearing her dress uniform with the decorations accumulated over 3 decades of service. The Distinguished Flying Cross, Bronze Star, Air Medal with multiple oak leaf clusters, and numerous other awards told the story of a career spent in service to country and principle. But she knew that her most important contributions couldn't be captured in ribbons and medals. Colonel Mitchell's impact, General Thompson continued, extends far beyond her own service. She has mentored over 200 female pilots, helped develop training programs that are used throughout the military, and demonstrated that excellence and leadership have nothing to do with gender and everything to do with character and competence. When Sarah rose to deliver her retirement speech, she looked out at an audience that represented the transformation she had helped bring about. Women in uniform sat alongside men, holding positions at every level of the military hierarchy. The sight would have been unimaginable when she had first put on a uniform 30 years earlier. "When I was a young pilot denied the opportunity to fly combat missions," Sarah began, "I never imagined that I would someday retire as the commander of a combat wing. The journey from that frustrated lieutenant to this moment has been possible because of the support of countless people who believe that merit should be the only factor in determining military assignments. Sarah paused to look at the section where her mentees were sitting. Captain Amanda Rogers, now a lieutenant colonel serving as a squadron commander at another base, smiled encouragingly. First Lieutenant Maria Santos, who had become Major Santos, and was now one of the most respected combat pilots in the Air Force, gave her a thumbs up. Dozens of other women who had served under Sarah's command or had been influenced by her example filled the rows. The mission I flew in Afghanistan 15 years ago saved 7 lives, Sarah continued. But the policy changes that resulted from that mission have created opportunities for thousands of women to serve their country in ways that were previously impossible. That multiplication of impact is what makes military service so meaningful, the understanding that our individual actions can create possibilities for future generations. Sarah clicked to a slide that showed a photograph of the newest class of pilot trainees at the Air Force Academy. The image showed young men and women standing together in front of an aircraft, their faces reflecting the same determination and enthusiasm that Sarah had felt when she first dreamed of becoming a military pilot. These young people will inherit a military that is more inclusive, more diverse, and more effective than ever before, Sarah said. They will face challenges that we can't imagine, but they will do so with the knowledge that their opportunities are limited only by their abilities and their commitment to excellence. As Sarah concluded her speech, she was presented with the flag that had flown over the 355th Wing during her command. The flag had accompanied the wing on deployments to 4 different countries and had been present during missions that had saved hundreds of lives and contributed to American national security objectives around the world. After the ceremony, Sarah was approached by a young woman in the uniform of an Air Force cadet. "Colonel Mitchell," the cadet said, "I'm Cadet First Class Jennifer Martinez from the Air Force Academy. I wanted to thank you for everything you've done to make it possible for women like me to pursue careers as combat pilots." Sarah was touched by the young woman's gratitude, but she also wanted to ensure that the next generation understood their role in continuing the progress that had been made. "Cadet Martinez, the most important thing you can do to honor what's been accomplished is to excel in your own service. Every woman who succeeds in the military makes it easier for the next woman to be accepted. Ma'am, I wanted you to know that your story was one of the reasons I decided to join the Air Force. I've studied your unauthorized mission in Afghanistan, and I understand that you took a significant risk to save lives. That kind of courage is what I hope to bring to my own service." Sarah smiled, remembering her own idealistic enthusiasm as a young cadet. "Cadet Martinez, courage isn't about taking unnecessary risks. It's about doing what's right, even when it's difficult. Focus on becoming the best officer and pilot you can be, and the opportunities to make a difference will present themselves." As the reception following the ceremony wound down, Sarah found herself standing alone near the A-10 aircraft that had been designated as her personal mount during her final deployment. The aircraft bore her name on the canopy rail and the mission, symbols that marked her combat sorties over the past 5 years. Major General Robert Hayes, who had taken over as wing commander, approached her as she stood looking at the aircraft. "Colonel, that bird is going to miss you. She's been your faithful companion through a lot of missions." Sarah ran her hand along the fuselage of the aircraft, feeling the familiar contours that had been her second home for so many years. "General, it's been an honor to fly her. Take good care of her and the people who will fly her after me." "Colonel, I wanted to ask you about your retirement plans. I know that several defense contractors and think tanks have offered you positions. What are you planning to do with your civilian career?" Sarah had given considerable thought to her post-military future over the past year. "General, I've accepted a position with the National Defense University, where I'll be developing curricula for military leadership programs. I want to help train the next generation of military leaders to think differently about diversity, inclusion, and organizational effectiveness. Colonel, that sounds like exactly the kind of position where you can continue to make a difference. Your experience in both policy development and operational leadership makes you uniquely qualified for that kind of work. As Sarah prepared to leave Davis-Monthan Air Force Base for the final time as an active duty officer, she took one last walk through the squadron operations centers where she had spent so many hours planning missions, debriefing flights, and mentoring young pilots. The walls were covered with photographs from deployments, mission planning materials, and awards that recognized the achievements of the wing's personnel. But what struck Sarah most forcefully was how normal it had become to see women in leadership positions throughout the wing. Female pilots planned missions alongside male pilots, women served as flight leads and instructor pilots, and gender had become largely irrelevant to the daily operations of the unit. The integration that had once seemed so controversial and uncertain had become an unremarkable part of military culture. Sarah's final act as wing commander was to sign a letter recommending Lieutenant Colonel Rogers for promotion to full colonel and assignment as a wing commander at another base. Rogers would become the second woman to command a combat wing, following the path that Sarah had pioneered, but facing far less scrutiny and controversy because the precedent had been established. As Sarah drove away from the base that evening, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from a frustrated young pilot to a senior leader who had helped transform American military culture. The unauthorized mission in Afghanistan that had started it all now seemed like a lifetime ago, but the principles that had guided that decision, courage, competence, and commitment to protecting others, had remained constant throughout her career. The work of building a more inclusive and effective military would continue without her, carried forward by the men and women she had trained and inspired. But Sarah was confident that the foundation was solid and that future generations would build upon the progress that had been made. The young woman who had been denied combat flight status had become a colonel who had ensured that no qualified person would ever again be denied opportunity because of their gender. It was a legacy worth 30 years of service, and it was just the beginning of the impact she would continue to have in civilian life. The unauthorized mission was over. The authorized future was just beginning. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.